I think for as long as Faye's been around, distant counter as an effect, or just having the ability to counterattack regardless of any range, has always been a valuable effect to have, even if it just meant running it in your A slot. However, some units also just had it built into their weapon, and that would at times be the most they would ever get in their weapon. Sometimes it would be 1 or 2 additional effects, rarely the latter, but for the most part, they were very conservative in what they would give out when it came to a distant counter weapon, and over time, this became much more of a bane than a boon. This would also carry over to their potential refines, at least the ones that were applicable, to the point where we ended up with the term the distant counter refine curse, where realistically, they were not getting as much stuff out of their weapon that a lot of other units just running distant counter in their A slot weren't accomplishing better. But before we get to that point, we gotta go back to where it all started, and by all started, I mean technically the beginning of the game, because we also had it way back then. This is the history of Fire Emblem Heroes' distant counter curse. Starting all the way back at 2017 at the beginning of the year, I think it was around February 6th, this is where we got the introduction of Faye to begin with. This was the brief period of time where we didn't have any semblance of skill adherence, meaning that whatever the unit came with is what they were stuck with. This only lasted about a month, but there were very dominant units in the meta, most of which were able to counterattack regardless of the range, whether it was because they had it built into their weapon like Ryoma, or they had it inheritably like Takumi or Hector, or I guess not inheritably, but they had close counter and distant counter respectively, which did make them difficult to take out comparatively to almost every other unit in the game. Some of them did fall off once skill adherence became a thing, but really at the end of it, a lot of distant counter stuff just became a lot more potent because you could run it on other characters that could do other things, but it didn't necessarily take away from stuff like Ryoma, mostly because there weren't really a lot of things that were competing with the likes of a distant counter weapon. There weren't really any better weapons inherently that could just be ran with distant counter, but there were definitely standout units that could still make use of other stuff, such as Iroh with Slaying Edge, distant counter Wrath. That was always a combo that people tended to use, but for the most part, it wasn't something that made them obsolete at the end of the day, mostly because there weren't really a lot of better effects or skills that made somebody like Ryoma obsolete. However, one of the funnier things that did come out of this is that every single armor was running distant counter in their A slot, even if they had distant counter built into their weapon, because they had to run it for scoring purposes. And back then, when Arena was the only relevant game mode, you just kind of had to min-max it. It was definitely more of a funnier time back then, but outside of a specific few amount of units that could take advantage of distant counter pretty well, maybe somebody like Ares with Dark Mistletoe Spiral Bonfire spam, or for other units that just had predominantly better stats than older units, there really wasn't a whole lot of competition going around when it came to just distant counter weapons versus the distant counter A slot, but distant counter in general has always been a popular A slot, even for a lot of the generics, just because having the ability to counter back has always been a valuable thing. However, while the standards for all sorts of other weapons were going on the rise, distant counter weapons for the most part weren't really on that same incline. Most future distant counter related weapons that released over the years didn't really get anything above the fact that they were able to counterattack. Maybe they got one additional effect, maybe it was something like Mistletoe's breath effect, or you got a guaranteed follow-up, or you had slaying, but it was a distant counter condition of you have to be above a certain HP threshold. There were some decent ones in the form of Altina and Fallen Ike, the former getting dual phase Brave and the latter getting Unity, but generally for the most part, a lot of other units were just getting a lot more effects and stats out of their PRFs that a lot of the distant counter units just weren't getting comparatively, and while they did have that open A slot for other skills, they didn't really have a lot of options that necessarily competed with other units with arguably better weapons even at the time. You could have had somebody like Chris who had penalty neutralization, stats, and slaying, and then when compared to one of the latest distant counter weapons of that time in the form of Sari, who had slaying and conditional distant counter, it just wasn't really a competition for who was the better godsword at the end of the day, and this was kind of a trap that most of these distant counter units fell into, because there were just a lot of better units that could take advantage of the effects that they got out of their weapon at the cost of their A slot comparatively to any other distant counter unit who had a free A slot. There wasn't really any competition when it came to it. It also didn't help that we were also getting into that territory of units getting refines. So realistically, a lot of these units that got decent enough refines could also run distant counter and could potentially compete, if not outperform, if they also had the stats to boot. And really, it only got to a point since the beginning of last year where we started getting a lot of decent A slots that could be competitive in their own right. But going that far ahead, we also got more variants of distant counter, including Prime, Bonus Doubler, Ferocity, Dart, even the ones that chip. There was just a lot more in the A slot that weren't just benefiting distant counter weapons, but also just anybody without distant counter innately, to the point where it wasn't really the most feasible thing to just have a DC weapon. Although all that in and of itself wasn't really necessarily a key factor behind the distant counter curse, because for the longest while, they didn't even refine any distant counter unit, which was incredibly weird because back in 2018, they gave Saber a distant counter refine, but it was on the count that it was a condition. And I'll get into the condition part of this sooner or later, but keep the condition part of it in mind. That being said, they just didn't really touch any unit with innate distant counter for the longest period of time, even when it started going into Book 2 units, because they ended up skipping a lot of units that did appear in Book 1, but were just not touched on the count that they had distant counter built into their weapons. And I don't think this could be any more emphasized when Fjorm and Legendary Ike got their own remixes. They got their brand new specials and a brand new set of skills in the form of Unity and Joint Drive Res, but they didn't get their refines at the same time. Rather, Ike got his refine 3 versions later in 5.5, and Fjorm got her refine in 5.7. It was really weird that they were still willing to upgrade these units without touching their weapons, but inevitably they did let go of that and gave a bunch of distant counter units a bunch of refines in one single go. And that is when we get to the conception of the distant counter refine curse, because on that version 5.5 batch, we got Camus, Harden, Ike, Legendary Ike, Black Knight, Zelgius, Ryoma, Legendary Ryoma, and Xander. And granted, a lot of these weapons were shared amongst a bunch of these units. It wasn't 9 weapon refines, but rather 5 spread across 9 units. Even so, you would think that for as long as they waited, they'd probably get a pretty decent amount of stuff, but barring Ryoma, who got full no follow-up in his weapon, by the way, which was really good for its time, the rest really flopped. You had Camus and Harden, who got stats and heal per hit, which wasn't inherently bad on paper, but it wasn't really enough for them to really stand out in the grand scheme of things, especially when compared to other characters that, again, got more stuff in their PRFs and that could run distant counter innately. Ike and Legendary Ike, who got slaying and stats, which if you remember Saber's refine from 3 versions ago, it is the exact same refine, except the condition is not there and it has 1 more spectrum. And while you could argue that Saber's refine wasn't exactly the most consistent thing, the fact that this is 3 versions ahead of that is very telling of how much they value distant counter as a whole, because generally speaking, this is not that much of an upgrade comparatively. Black Knight and Zelgius also got the same effect as Ike and Legendary Ike. The only difference between him and Ike, though, is that he also had Black Luna, which at least allowed him to stand out a bit more. Granted, it wasn't a whole lot, but it was still something that at least allowed him to proc Black Luna on a more consistent basis. And then you had Xander, who had follow-up denial, and I mean, that just wasn't good outright, especially when compared to units that got refines before that point, or even a bit after. They just were not on the same level as running that specific weapon with distant counter. It was really jarring seeing something like that, because even at the time, there weren't really a lot of competitive A slots that really allowed them to stand out comparatively. Again, barring Ryoma, because having no follow-up built into his weapon was a very big deal. The next batch that we did get with distant counter refines was the Fjorm batch, with Fjorm, obviously, Legendary Grima, Fallen Grima, which male and female respectively, and Dorcas didn't really fare much better either, although I would definitely say Fiorm came out a bit more unscathed because she did get penalty neutralization on top of a pretty decent amount of stats. I would say she was the only one of that batch that really came out of that not bad, at least. And I think really when it came to these distant counter refines, they were such a gamble in terms of effectiveness because there really weren't any incentive to use them over anybody else that could just realistically have better effects or even more effects, and then running a distant counter A slot. Some were able to get around this, of course, because they had additional stuff such as Legendary Tiki for a period of time because she had a pure FC slot, which was save and it granted extra stats, or even, funnily enough, Yenfei, who was a freebie Grand Hero battle unit. And granted, he was definitely a lot more overhyped comparatively to a lot of other characters, but distant counter with damage reduction built into the weapon was more or less a similar situation to what Ryoma was with no follow-up built into his weapon. The only caveat is that he had to be solo, but I don't think that was really that big of a deal in some aspects, at least for its time. Even so, a lot of refines would follow this similar pattern of, well, it's not the worst thing in the world, so I guess it's good enough, but in most cases, a distant counter refine was never really going to be on the same level as any other unit in a similar archetype with a PRF because they just ended up having more effects to work with. Even if that weapon had a condition, quote unquote, it had to be easily the most workable condition in the world, or it could even been just a really bad condition. It doesn't matter how good or bad it was, you were just inherently going to get more stuff out of it just as long as it had a chance to fail or not go off. And this could still be emphasized within the distant counter realm with stuff like Saber and Kanegas. I already went over Saber as much as I possibly could, but Kanegas was definitely before that point in time where they stopped caring about distant counter being built into the weapon. This was also before Brave Dimitri's refine, which was considered really, really good. Kanegas got a bunch of stats. He had AoE damage reduction, which even to this day is still incredibly valuable. He had follow-up damage reduction in the form of something like Black Eagle Rule, and he got a guaranteed follow-up attack, all on the premise of him being transformed, which is definitely a lot easier now, but back then it wasn't exactly the hardest thing to accomplish. Meanwhile, for another colorless armor that got a refine only a few months later in the form of Fallen Tiki, we got a distant counter refine at base that did not get upgraded, but for the refine, it got some stats, and if she initiated combat, she got a guaranteed follow-up. Or, if the foe initiated combat, the foe could not make a follow-up attack. This pales in comparison to Kanegas only because there is no condition for Tikis whatsoever beyond if you initiate or you don't initiate, which is essentially free. But this is how IS has generally treated weapons that weren't exactly based on any condition whatsoever, although I would argue nowadays they don't really care because power creep has gone through the roof, but it did matter at that point in time, especially when it came to distant counter weapons. Following Brave Dimitri, where he got true damage reduction built into his weapon, that's when there was more hope for distant counter weapons actually being competent, at least when it came to refines. But that was also the same batch we got the Celthus refine, which was very bad. It was probably on a similar level to that of Ike's, at least relatively speaking. It had the base distant counter, you had Spectrum 4, and then you had damage reduction, except Ike had slaying instead. It was as nothing as you could possibly make it. And this was on the same batch as Brave Dimitri, version 6.9 by the way. By this point, there was really no reason for these refines to be as bad as they were, or at least on a mediocre scale comparatively to a lot of other characters. Even so, I would say that post this and Fallen Tiki, they did get a bit better over time, although the amount of distant counter refines that we've gotten since Brave Dimitri and Celthus, and Fallen Tiki, since I did include her and she was one version after them, was very little. We had the Altinas, who were inevitably going to be good no matter what because they had dual phase Brave built into their weapon, which by that point in time was still incredibly strong. You had Freya, who wasn't necessarily bad in her own right. Ocean and Sari also got recent refines, but they were also conditional distant counter, so I don't know if you want to count that. And then we also got Fallen Ike, but even when comparing this back to any sort of DC weapon relative to their own times, this is so much more than any other distant counter refine would have ever gotten. And it's crazy to think that there was a period of time where just because you had distant counter built into your weapon means that you weren't really going to get a lot of effects out of your weapon refine, because for some reason it was just that highly valued. Even though nowadays having distant counter built into your weapon opens up a lot more now than it did any time in the past. Although, if I had to guess, and I most likely said this earlier, it's because they realized that power levels were just going through the roof, and it really made no sense to keep kneecapping distant counter weapons when they're already inherently weaker than most other PRFs. Although, I wouldn't say it's a guarantee now that any DC-related unit is always going to be good, even on a refine. But, you know, considering recent examples and newer additions in the form of Valentine's Myrrh and Emblem Ike, I think the last thing they're really worried about nowadays is whether a weapon has innate distant counter, especially now that distant counter is a sacred seal for both dragons and sword, lances, and axes. Yeah, we got to that point where distant counter is just that free of an effect. It's kind of crazy. Also, to rub more salt in the wound that is the distant counter refines for a good period of time, the dragon distant counter seal came before CY06, which was also before Sothis' refine, which meant that any dragon could realistically just outperform her on a basic scale. It was that bad. And then we also got the distant counter for sword, lance, axe units back at the beginning of 2024. So by that point in time, I just don't think they really cared about who had distant counter, where they had it, and why they have it. At this point, everything is thrown to the wall, and if it works, it works, and if it sticks, it sticks. They're just here to just make power levels even crazier, I guess. But for what it's worth, I'm just glad they're not going to really be kneecapping distant counter weapons on the basis that distant counter is this highly coveted effect, even though it really isn't. Although one thing I am curious about is Shinnon's upcoming refine, because he is the only close counter bow that we have in the game, and it is also a conditional close counter weapon. I don't want to necessarily jinx it one way or the other, but I guarantee you by future comments, it's going to be known somewhere, sometime. Either way, I think it's going to be interesting what they do with him, because he is the only instance of a close counter unit like that. Although whether IS really cares about making any sort of unit good or bad is pretty much at their own discretion. And in conclusion, well, Sothis kind of sucks,